Hello, you're watching the Ideas Factory at ORF, and I'm Naghma. Joining me is Professor Pant. This month, the weeks that have gone by have seen quite a few political upheavals worldwide. An ex prime minister was shot dead while he was campaigning in a rally. A prime minister has been forced to quit. Another president has been forced to flee the country. We're looking at Japan, Sri Lanka, Britain. So, a lot of upheaval that has taken place. We will look at all this and some more issues which are quite important as far as India is concerned. A warm welcome to you, Harsh. Let's look at Sri Lanka first. What's happening? This country is a broken country right now, politically and economically. As we talk, we also are getting news of a parliament being convened of Rajapaksa now in Singapore, but has been asked to leave the country as soon as this 15 days. So there is, of course, there's a lot of political uncertainty in Sri Lanka. We do see people on the roads. There is no fuel. Their essential commodities are in great shortage. There's no medicine for people, water shortage, fuel crisis, all of that. That's why we see the anger that we've seen on the streets. But there is also no promise in near future that things will be better. So there is political uncertainty, there's economic uncertainty, and there doesn't seem to be much help coming Sri Lanka's way. How do we look at Sri Lanka's condition in the coming months or years?
Well, I think it's a very sorry state of affairs, Naghma. And we have talked about this in the past as well about the crisis, how it has been brewing for such a long time, and the inability of Sri Lankan political class to get its act together, for the leadership of Mahinda, of Gotabaya Rajapaksa, to understand the real nature of the problem. He continued to think that he will get away with this, that somehow by removing his clan from the top positions initially, and bringing in a new government by Ranil Wickremesinghe, he thought that that the crisis is being managed. But clearly, people thought otherwise, and clearly, the ground realities spoke a different story. And I think that means that today Sri Lanka is on the verge of a crisis unlike any it has seen. And the trouble here is that there is, it's not as if we know what is likely to happen, and how this will pan out, because the real consequences are unfolding even as we speak. The economic crisis is not going anywhere in a hurry. The political crisis, I think, is even bigger, because the legitimacy of course, the Rajapaksa clan has been has been shredded, and there's no credibility, in fact, remaining for them. But there is also the larger issue that you have Wickremesinghe, who's seen as an appointee of Gotabaya Rajapaksa, so his credibility is also on the line. And then there is the question of whether the political class can get its act together, can work together to form an all-party government. All those questions linger for Sri Lanka, and I think the sooner the political class comes to terms with the scale of the challenge, the better it would be for Sri Lanka. But unfortunately, even if that happens, the IMF conditionalities, we know, if you end up, if Sri Lanka ends up having negotiations with IMF and getting a package deal, then I think we know the challenge that comes with IMF, and we know that it's going to be a long, painful road ahead for ordinary Sri Lankans, because the government will have to get its act together, primarily by reducing expenditure, primarily by cutting social sector spending in the short term, so that the long term can emerge as brighter. But I think the challenge has just begun, and Gotabaya Paksha has not done himself any credit by fleeing the way he has fled. And I think the consequences, we are seeing that no country wants to help him out at this point. We know he has to flee from Maldives to Singapore, and we know that he has he has become a radioactive leader at this point. That no country would want to support him and incur the wrath of the Sri Lankan people, because they really do see him and his clan and his family as the real source of the problem, and they are very angry. That this is reflected on the street protests, but it is also reflected in the way they have continued to insist on removal of even Wickremesinghe. So clearly, I think the challenges are huge. The scale of those challenges is so big that unless the political class comes together and gives a unified response, I don't think there is going to be there's going to be a shift very soon. And also,
Yes.
I think it is very important to have a conversation with the people, because
Yes.
I don't think that people are not, there is a trust deficit between the political class and the wider Sri Lankan populace.
Absolutely. Most people have been pointing this out, that there is a communication breakdown actually, and the people do not know what's happening. And, like you said, their political class has to come together in a unified way. But Sri Lanka, unfortunately, has also seen a lot of social strife. It's divided ethnically, socially. Looking at keeping this in mind, do you think that's a possibility? Also, we know that even Mahinda Rajapaksa has been barred from leaving the country. There's a lot of anger against Ranil Wickremesinghe. Uh, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, of course, is like you said, a radioactive leader. No country is willing to touch him. Not even his great friend China. China is actually nowhere right now in the scene. What else? What can India do? India has been helping Sri Lanka in all ways possible, but right now, looking at the situation, what are the options for India? Or it's a matter of great concern that a neighbor is so disturbed politically, and at least the economic problem doesn't seem to be going away very soon.
Yes, I think for India, this is certainly a very serious issue right on its doorsteps, which has immense consequences for security, with immense consequences for people to people ties. We know the issue of migration also crops up occasionally. And we know that even a small issue can create some. Big long-term challenges. But I think so far India has been signaling it right. India has been making it very clear that whatever help India has been giving, it is it is by keeping the interests of Sri Lankan people at heart, and at the heart of its response. And I think, in a sense, that has been the difference between India and China. China, as you rightly point out, has been almost has almost disappeared from the scene, and is unwilling to even make statements apart from generic ones. So I think China is very cautious, because it knows that it is seen as a very close ally of the Rajapakshas. And given the anger against the Rajapakshas, it would be foolhardy for China to enter into the scene at all. So I think China has been keeping a safe distance. But the real challenge for India is that India can't afford to do that. India is not a distant neighbor. India is invested in the well-being of Sri Lankan people, and I think so far the help has been more than 3.8 billion dollars, has been quite significant. But I think India will have to do more. But what India perhaps will have to do more, importantly, will be to galvanize an international response to this crisis. This is not something that IMF alone can take care of. This is not something that India alone can take care of. The international community will have to come together and help a country that till a few years back was seen as a rising star among middle income countries. It was doing so well, exceptionally well. So I think it is something that the international community will have to look at seriously, and also India's neighbors and other small countries that are in this habit of taking loans and incurring debts of this kind will have to rethink their economic strategies, because what this exemplifies is that economic mismanagement can very quickly turn into political anarchy. And this is something that all of India's neighbors, all of I think small countries in the Indian Ocean, and all developing countries should be very, very cognizant of.
It's a lesson for all the countries. Economic mismanagement has led to this political anarchy. It's clearly just not COVID. There's been a lot of mismanagement economically, and that is why the anger against the ruling class, especially Rajapaksa clan. Uh, Sri Lanka, of course, the problem continues. It's a very dire situation there, and we just hope that things settle down at least politically. But let's look at Britain, Harsh. What's happening there? The race for the next British Prime Minister is heating up. Rishi Sunak seems to be till now on a winning streak, but we've also seen Boris Johnson raise the pitch that back anyone else and not Rishi Sunak. So all that is really interesting there right now. And he's how do you see this unfolding? I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty with Scott in the midst of a lot of scandals, but there have been things against Sunak too. So what are his chances, and how do you see this settling down?
I think Sunak is doing well so far. Rishi Sunak is the front runner, as we all know. But I think the challenge that he faces, and I think the challenge which the Tories, the Conservative Party, will be thinking very, very carefully about, is that how do you choose a leader who is widely viewed in Rishi Sunak in this case is viewed as coming from the most elite section of the country, that he's seen as a very, very wealthy person. He's seen as someone who has stalked off and who has been reluctant to do raise wages, which was one of the points of discussion at one point in time. He wanted to consolidate British finances fiscally, and so he was against what he thought was frivolous expenditures not needed at this particular time. He wanted to consolidate fiscally British finances, and so he was seen as a fiscal conservative. And many in the country perhaps view him as a problem at a time when ordinary Britons are facing enormous economic challenges and they would want more government help. So I think for conservatives, as they would be going into and entering into elections in 2023, the question would be whether they would be able to manage this with the Labour Party that is on the rise, and Labour will go hammer and tongs at Rishi Sunak if he's elected. So I think that is his Achilles heel, that is his vulnerability. And also, of course, when you talk of Johnson and Sunak, they were very close at one point in time, but it was Sunak's resignation that tipped the scale against Johnson. So therefore, now Johnson is insisting that he would have anyone but Rishi Sunak to succeed him. How far is he able to convince the rank and file of Conservative Party? That remains to be seen. But I think there is also a larger issue here in the fall of Boris Johnson, that here is a leader who was so charismatic, who was seen as immensely talented, but because of sheer lack of discipline, has ended up will end up being a footnote in the history of British politics. He had so much potential. He delivered Brexit, one of the most interesting aspects of British of Tory demands for a very long time. He led Tories from the front in 2019 elections, a very decisive mandate. But again, in the end, a series of mistakes, a series of malgovernance and overconfidence in his own ability to manage that, and that led to his collapse. And I think this is not simply a collapse in the support of Boris Johnson, but it is also impacting the Conservatives nationally. Conservatives who have been the dominant party for the last 2 decades, if not more, in British politics. So I think there is a lot happening in British politics, and Rishi Sunak and whatever happens in September, if Rishi Sunak gets elected or someone else gets elected, I think that the Conservative Party is in for some tough times ahead.
Absolutely. So Rishi Sunak faces a lot of challenge. The fate of the Conservative Party is also not certain. There are many questions there. And along with it, interestingly, you point out that Boris Johnson, who got a very decisive mandate, may end up being a footnote in the history of British politics. Another really interesting news that has come out, or a favorable news that has come out of the US for India, is the Katsa waiver, which may come through, Harsh. The US House has, through voice vote, approved of the Katsa waiver, special Katsa waiver for India, but there's still a long road ahead. The President has the final word, and if this comes through, then India will be able to purchase the S-400 from Russia. But interestingly, this comes at a time when the Russia-Ukraine clash, the war, has taken place, and India, very interestingly, has maintained a very independent stand, although India has always said that it is not in favor of the war, but has not really openly condemned Russia for its act the way the West would have wanted. But now this special waiver for India at a time when China and Russia have come a little close, how does it benefit India? What does it mean for America? And why this special waiver for India, if we look at India's position geopolitically? How can we explain that?
I think it speaks certainly to the strength of India-US relationship. That at a time when a number of people, a number of a growing section has been voicing concern about the divergences over Ukraine. we end up in a situation that the House of Congress, which is actually the most difficult part of the U.S. political establishment to convince, has been India has been able to convince the U.S. House of Congress that this is an important relationship, and that India should be granted a waiver. And I think this speaks to the strength of the relationship, that even at this particular time, when differences are very visible on the Russia question, the bilateral relationship between India and the US has reached a point where there is greater degree of confidence than there has ever been today in India's ability to shape the regional balance of power in the Indo-Pacific, and to help America achieve some of its objectives. So I think it's ironical that at a time when India is taking positions which are going against the American position on Russia, this kind of confidence is visible, and it is visible in U.S. House of Congress, which has been very, very critical on certain issues as far as India is concerned. So I think Indian diplomacy has to be given credit for achieving this result. I think Senate is certainly, it will now go to the Senate, and ultimately it is the prerogative of the Biden administration. But I think the message that is coming out of Washington is that the relationship is stable, that the relationship remains supported by all sections of the U.S. government, the executive as well as the legislature, and that despite Russia, despite this Ukraine question, the relationship has not, seen a deterioration, and one hopes that that this would allow India not only to India is already in the process of buying S-400, and India made it very clear that it is important for India's national security interests that these platforms are available to India, and because India is facing China, India is facing China as an operational reality along the LAC, and there is and India, if India has to stand on its own, if India has to take on China on its own, such platforms are very important. And this is a message that has gone out, and this is a message that is in sync with also America's strategy, that America's partners in the Indo-Pacific are able to manage China's rise on their own. So interestingly, there is a dynamic now taking place between America and its partners and allies in the Indo-Pacific, where the relationships between them, among them, are changing. And this, I think, underscores that reality for India and for Washington, and this is an important message from Washington.
Yes, while it is good news for India, it's also, I think, very significant for America, strengthening the India-US defense partnership as far as China is concerned, or the threat from China is concerned. Before we wrap up this episode of the Ideas Factory, Harsh, I would like you to reflect upon Shinzo Abe's legacy. Shinzo Abe, the prime minister who's probably the longest serving prime minister of Japan, and who worked a lot in terms of India-Japan relationship, or his legacy, his footprint on the global geopolitics, and you've been following it really closely. It was the way he was shot at in a rally, and of course Twitter was abuzz with a lot of conspiracy theories and the Chinese angle and all of that. But I want you to reflect upon the India-Japan ties during his term, and also his imprint on global strategy, the initiatives that he took.
Naghma, I think there are very few leaders in recent history, in recent memory, who perhaps have this kind of a legacy that Abe leaves behind, because his imprint is all over the place. It's not simply, of course, it is he was Japanese prime minister. And he challenged some of the fundamental assumptions of Japanese politics, some of the fundamental ideas in Japanese politics that have underscored Japan's view of the world, view of itself, and he challenged it frontally. He managed to renew the debate and refocus that debate in a very, very different platform. And remember, this is a self-confessed conservative. This is a conservative prime minister, and conservatives are meant to preserve the status quo. But he challenged the status quo within Japan, in Japanese foreign policy, and in the larger regional and global geopolitical landscape. From, I think, today, as you look at Japan that is more confidently trying to assert itself in the Indo-Pacific. When you look at Japan's defense reforms, when you look at Japan's foreign policy outreach to its key partners, without Shinzo Abe's legacy, without Shinzo Abe's push, that would not have been possible. When you look at Japan's push towards re-energizing its economy, there are elements of Shinzo Abe's legacy that will always be present now. He shook the, I think, Japanese bureaucracy in ways that few recent prime ministers have done. And then when you look at his global and regional outlook, he was very aware of the fact that the tectonic plates in Indo-Pacific are shifting. Of course, he was in many ways he shaped the discourse on the Indo-Pacific right when he was a prime minister and when he came to India in 2007. His famous speech, Conference of the Two Seas, to Indian Parliament. He laid down this idea that Indian Ocean and Pacific Oceans should not be seen as two distinct entities. And he also pushed India that India should be doing much more. India should be much more ambitious about its foreign policy outlook. And I think that has been one of the reasons, one of the ways in which Indian prime ministers, both Dr. Manmohan Singh and followed by Prime Minister Modi, have looked at India's role in East and Southeast Asia and this push towards the Indo-Pacific narrative. And I think without him, without his push, without his intellectual demarcation of the boundaries of Indo-Pacific, without his, he led the way in terms of shaping this narrative. Without his leadership, it would have been it would not have been possible to have this kind of acceptance of this discourse as we see today. So I think in so many ways, his legacy is so profound that we'll be living with the world, perhaps, or with with the architecture that he shaped for the foreseeable future. And India, in particular, has to be really grateful for a friend like Abe who could push India in areas where India was reluctant to go. India was diffident, but he, as a true friend, pushed India to do much more, to be a balancer, to be a critical player, to be a leading player in the Indo-Pacific narrative. And I think without India, there would be no Indo-Pacific. But without Abe, there would be, India would not be India would not be playing the kind of role that it played. And therefore, by buttressing India-Japan relationship and removing some of the long-held problems, for example, the nuclear question, he made it very seamless. India-Japan relationship is one of the most trouble-free relationships today that we have. And that is because of Abe, who could conceive of a new relationship in a new era of the Indo-Pacific. So I think we owe him a lot here in India. And I think perhaps throughout the world, when you look at global geopolitics and global geostrategy evolving, Abe's imprint, Abe's legacy is all over the place.
Yes, yes, of course. Abe's, his imprint of his politics is really huge on global geopolitics. You spoke of the Indian Ocean and the Indo-Pacific and how it's shaping up and how Abe was instrumental in actually pushing this narrative. But Harsh, very quickly before we end this episode, I want a quick comment from you on a new grouping that has come up, the I2, U2, India, Israel, US, UAE, and it's being looked upon as a quad for West Asia. So a new grouping, a new platform as far as West Asia is concerned. What would be its vision or objective? What is its objective?
I think it's a very interesting and innovative platform, partly because it links Middle East or West Asia to South Asia in ways that we had not seen in the past. It was conceived last year at the foreign ministerial level, and this week we have seen the first leaders level summit during Biden's visit to Israel.
Sure.
And I think it builds on this idea that a new kind of an architecture is emerging in West Asia, where you have post-Abraham Accords, Israel, UAE, and other Gulf countries working closely together. There are reports of even Saudis reaching out to Israel and having a closer relationship. And I think to bring India into the fold means that a number of the geo-economic problems, and I think the I2U2 summit laid out problems like health, foods, and you had infrastructure, space, all of these issues, all of these verticals, water, where these countries can bring in their wealth funds, investments, and a country like Israel can bring in its innovation. India can bring scale. If you have this kind of a platform, this allows for a number of these issues being tackled frontally. So what is emerging is that I2U2 is likely to emerge as a very significant geo-economic platform in an in a region which is known for its geopolitical configurations. So it's an innovative platform. It's a new platform. A lot will depend on how some of the projects that it has identified in this leaders level summit will get fructified, will be operationalized. But I think the hope is that as the geopolitical architecture of West Asia changes and India becomes more invested as a rising power in the Arabian Sea, I2U2 can provide that fulcrum around which a number of these conversations, specifically on geoeconomics, can revolve.
Yes, very interesting grouping with India coming together with the US, with Israel and the UAE. So that is something that one would look forward to, what kind of relationship emerges and how does this grouping really work. Thank you so much, Harsh, for that analysis and discussion. It's been a rather interesting week, or I would say a very turbulent couple of weeks for the world, with so much happening in Sri Lanka, in Britain, in Japan. We will keep following up on these big issues. Thank you so much for watching and being with us for today's episode.